Welcome to your Unit 2 video teaching lesson. Before you move on, I would encourage you, if you have not completed the assignments for Unit 1, the video lesson that was in there, 7 Traits of a Civilization, as well as the Get to Know You assignment, I would go back and do those before proceeding. I know it might be tempting to hop into Unit 2 to Unit 5 to Unit 6, but I think your life is going to be easier as a student no matter what time of the year you're taking this if you go in sequential order. And obviously, those points mean quite a deal to you as a student. So make sure those are done and submitted before proceeding. But if you are ready, let's go ahead and talk about Mesopotamia, aka the land between the rivers, which saw basically the first civilizations live or settle there. Because up to this point, human beings had largely been hunter gatherers and wanderers. And this area, nicknamed the Fertile Crescent, it's in the modern day like Middle East. If you've ever heard of the countries like Iraq and things like that, it is in this area human beings begin to live and settle. Primarily because there were two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, which obviously provided water and a place where civilizations could begin. Now, the first group that's going to settle there is Sumer, or the people itself, the Sumerians. And they're really the first group in the Fertile Crescent to live and have all of those 7 traits of civilization that you learned about in Unit 1. For example, they set up city-state governments where each little city was kind of its own thing, its own country, and its own government. But together, put them all, band them all together, and you had the civilization of Sumer. They also had a social class system, which meant certain people had more power and influence and wealth than others, where their kings and rulers would be at the tippy top and more peasants and slaves. There would be a greater amount of them, but they would have much less influence at the bottom of the social pyramid. Also, the really big thing that Sumer is known for is creating the very first forms of writing in cuneiform, which arguably in this assignment you'll do later in Unit 2, writing is arguably the most important invention in the history of human beings, and its origins begin with Sumer. To go along with writing, the Sumerians contributed stuff as far back as they were, contributed things that exist in the world today, like how we have the concept for 60 minutes to an hour, 360 degrees for a circle, and other things like that. They contributed to the fields of astronomy and things of that nature. So it's important to note with these really old civilizations that they're not as outdated and irrelevant as you might think they are, considering how far back in history they existed. This is a visual breakdown of cuneiform. You can see that they actually used what they called tokens, and they would press them into clay tablets to make symbols or signs. They didn't have an alphabet yet, and a lot of it was done to record trade and like economic exchanges, but as well as religious things, prayers, also laws, stories, things like that. And cuneiform, it's very important to note, was also passed down to other civilizations after Sumeria ceased to exist and ceased to be an empire. So it had a legacy beyond simply the Sumer people. Another group that was in Mesopotamia for some time, well over 1,000 years actually, was Babylon, or the Babylonian Empire. If you have any familiarity with the Christian or Jewish Old Testament, Babylon is actually a part of the story of that part of the Bible, but that doesn't necessarily apply to everybody's family background and knowledge, but worth mentioning. One thing that might stand out the most in terms of importance in our world today would be something called Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi was actually a ruler of Babylon, and this code is really, really important because it's one of the first times in human history that laws were written down and organized the way we have laws written down and organized today, or have school rules and school laws organized today. And they split them into different categories like criminal laws and civil laws. Civil law has more to do with money, and criminal law obviously has to do with more the harm of other people. And while laws have changed quite a bit since Hammurabi, this was kind of a foundational thing because it codified and organized things. It made laws public to people. It created standards for punishment if you did break those laws. And it's kind of like the first step to the way we have laws and courts um, in our societies today, like in the United States and in other parts of the world. Hammurabi's Code, a very significant early development in Mesopotamia. Now, there were several other groups that lived in and around Mesopotamia. Assyria was one of the first civilizations in human history that gained a reputation for their army, for their military, for their ability to conquer. You can see in this quote on the box to the left that they were very vicious, very intimidating, and they were one of the first peoples that created the idea of demanding taxes for those that they conquered, and maybe even like executing or deporting people that they saw as threats or enemies to them. And certainly Assyria is not going to be the last group in human history that will use their military to gain control, to gain power, um, and to assert their authority in the region of the world where they are located. Persia. Perhaps you've seen there's some Hollywood films that depict Persia, sometimes inaccurately, but they're a little bit more well known of a name. They exist for a couple hundred years, or at least the peak of their powers exist in that 559 to 331 BCE window. They actually created and organized a lot of things that we even like have today in modern civilizations. They organize government into things that we call bureaucracies, where they have like different departments, and different departments are in charge of roads or tax collecting or money and things like that. Um, I just said it, but they created a road system. They had mail delivery, or at least a very early form of it. And they were one of the first empires ever, certainly we're used to money today, that had a money based economy to be able to have purchase power and instead of just trading physical items with one another, the idea of purchasing things that you might need or want. Finally, the Phoenicians, who were kind of in and around a little bit west of Mesopotamia and like the Mediterranean, they contributed in this kind of honing in on writing feature of this lesson. They're actually the creators of the basis of the modern day alphabets. Um, Cuneiform's first form of writing, but it was all symbol based, whereas the Phoenicians, as you can see over here on the left, developed the idea of an alphabet, which the Greeks and then the Romans with Latin are going to transform into the alphabets we know today in French and in Spanish and in Italian, and probably most likely, if you're taking this class, the English language that you speak and write with. So Mesopotamia filled with examples of um, early foundational things that still exist in our world today. Now, bouncing to a different part of the world, I want to mention China in our Unit 2 as well. Chinese history can be very, very complicated. It's not all the way understood, and it's very, very long. So, this will give you kind of a one slide foundational lesson on that. Okay. The key to ruling China, if you were going to try to rule China in the earliest years of its history, was controlling its two areas, which generally speaking were the buffer, which were borderlands, kind of wilderness-ish. Not a lot of people live there, and the core, which is where most people lived. And you needed both to be able to properly rule China, because the buffer lands were key to keeping out outside invasions and things like that. But the core obviously mattered because that's where your people were. And China went through all this is Chinese history in a nutshell. China went through all kinds of cycles of unity and fragmentation, coming together and being organized, and then falling apart, going to war with each other, coming together, be organized, falling apart, going into war with each other, in kind of a circle you can see in that picture over there on the right, and kind of a vicious circle that like never really stopped. It was the same thing on repeat over and over. I did just mention it, but the core, if you've heard of these, was blessed with rivers like the Yellow and Yangtze. So they had that in common with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that made up Mesopotamia. And you'll learn about the Nile River with Egypt next unit. So China had its geographical benefits, but they always had trouble with the cycles of unity and fragmentation. What emerges to control China are something called dynasties, which are families that would rule and control China for a period of time. So early ones include the Shang and the Zhou dynasties, and they were ones that organized the earliest clans and kingdoms in Chinese history. You might think how like America has organized states. I guess you could kind of compare that to clans and kingdoms, although it wouldn't be exact. And these early Chinese dynasties, especially the Zhou, came up with the concept of the mandate of heaven, which basically they thought meant a higher power would be would grant them the ability to have a dynasty, and as long as they were a good ruler, their family would be the Chinese dynasty in charge forever. But then, if you became a bad ruler, or you were invaded, or there was a natural disaster, you could possibly lose the mandate of heaven. I think this picture right here will help you with this a little bit. A new dynasty like the Zhou would emerge, or the Han dynasty down the road, and they would get to have it for several generations. That have it meaning control of China. But as the dynasty would age and there would be problems, losing control of certain areas, ignoring corrupt officials, the dynasty would lose its mandate of heaven, the higher power that kind of allowed it to be in charge. And then problems would emerge like invasion, peasant revolts, floods, famine, earthquake, and then that would allow a new dynasty or a new family to claim the mandate of heaven, and the cycle would repeat itself. And that is what we know as the Chinese dynastic cycle, and it explains in a very simple way the long, complicated history of ancient China. With that in mind, you should, after watching this video lesson, go when you're able to Canvas, and you have two things for points after this video teaching. One, a very simple exit ticket that I would almost do right away after this video ends, because it is simply a reflection on the teaching that I just provided to you. The second assignment is worth a little bit more because it's going in the assessment category, and it's going to have you explore some links on the inventions and the early origins of writing, and it's going to challenge you to make a little bit of an argument about what if writing is truly the most important invention in human history. So 2 grades for Unit 2. Obviously, you want to do those before you would start anything with Unit 3. And per usual, you can always email me, reach out, contact, whatever, if you have any confusion, especially with the graded material. Have a great rest of your day, whatever time of the day it is, and good luck with the rest of your work in this semester.